He bought a flooded claim for $3 at auction. A deaf boy was hiding in the mine. The auctioneer had a cough and a pocket watch he kept checking, like he had somewhere better to be, which nobody in Garnet, Colorado did. It was March. The mud was the color of a bad bruise, and the wind had been coming sideways off the divide since Tuesday. I wasn't there to buy anything. I want to be plain about that. I'd ridden the 3 miles into town because Hector Prout owed me $4 for a fence post repair, and I'd been waiting 6 weeks on it. And I knew the only place Hector would be on a Thursday was at an auction, because Hector loved an auction the way some men love whiskey. Not for what he got out of it, but for the feeling of being in the middle of something. I found him. He paid me in 2 crumpled bills, and some coin he dug out of his boot, and I should have turned around and gone home right then. Instead, I stayed for the Delacroix claim. Everybody knew the Delacroix claim. Old Ferris Delacroix had sunk a shaft on the south slope of Carpenter Ridge back in '71, pulled maybe $900 in color out of it over 4 years, then hit a fault line and flooded the whole thing in the spring of '76. He'd been trying to sell it ever since. The county finally took it for back taxes 2 years after he died, and now here it was on the block, and the auctioneer didn't even bother to describe it. He just said Delacroix parcel, Carpenter Ridge as is, and looked at his watch. Nobody bid. I don't know why I raised my hand. Stubbornness, maybe. Some kind of irritation at how fast a man's life's work gets dismissed. 4 years in a hole in the ground reduced to a cough and a watch check. The auctioneer looked at me like I'd done something unexpected. $1, I said. The county man beside him whispered something. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Minimum bid is $3, sir, on account of the filing fee. 3 then. Nobody else bid. Of course nobody else bid. The auctioneer banged his gavel, and I was the owner of a flooded mine I didn't need, couldn't use, on land I'd never set foot on. For $3 I was going to regret spending. That's how it started. That's the whole dignified beginning of it. I rode up to the Delacroix parcel the next morning, not because I had a plan, but because I'd paid $3 for something and I was constitutionally unable to own something I hadn't looked at. My horse, a bay gelding named after nobody, picked his way up the south slope through wet scrub oak and patches of old snow. Carpenter Ridge runs roughly east-west, and at that hour the sun hadn't cleared it yet, so the whole south face was in gray shadow, cold and quiet. The claim was, well, it was what you'd expect. A log hoist structure half collapsed, the windlass cable rusted to the drum, the shaft collar rimmed with ice. You could smell the water down there, that particular underground cold water smell, dark and mineral and old. I got down and walked the collar and looked in and saw black water maybe 8 feet down, sitting flat and still. The cabin was 30 yards off, 1 room, dirt floor, the stovepipe gone, a door that didn't sit true in its frame. I pushed it open. Mouse sign. A rusted pan. Some old wax on a shelf where a candle had been for years. A man's life down to the last wax drip. I was about to go when I heard something. Not a sound you could name, more of a shift. The cabin was behind me and the sound came from somewhere between me and the shaft. I stood still. It came again, a scrape, like a boot heel on rock, very small. I walked back toward the shaft collar, slow, and that's when I saw the boy. He was wedged between the hoist frame and the shaft collar, sitting on a plank someone had laid across 2 rock outcrops to keep him off the frozen ground. He had a wool coat on that was too big for him, and he was looking straight at me with the particular expression of a child who is frightened but has decided not to show it. Maybe 9 years old, maybe 10, dark-haired, thin-faced. His hands were tucked up under his arms for warmth. I said, "Hey there, son." He didn't answer. I crouched down to his level, said it again. He watched my mouth, not my eyes, which is when I understood. I held up one hand slow to show him I wasn't coming at him. He tracked the hand, alert and calm, like a deer that's decided it can afford to think before it runs. I pointed at myself. "James Alcott," I said clearly. Then I pointed at him and raised my eyebrows. He considered that for a moment. Then he touched his own chest and mouthed something. I couldn't read it. I shook my head gently, sorry. He looked around, spotted a flat rock and went to it, scratched a letter in the frost on its surface. N, then another. O, then A, then H. Noah. I nodded. Noah, I said, making sure he could see my mouth. He nodded back. He'd been up there 3 days, was my guess by the look of him, though I didn't learn the details until later. He was cold through, the kind of cold that's got into the bones and set up residence, but he wasn't panicked and he wasn't hurt. He'd had some sense about him, stayed out of the wind, kept moving enough to stay unfrozen, found a seep at the base of the ridge where he'd been drinking. He had half a biscuit wrapped in a handkerchief in his coat pocket, and he showed it to me seriously, as if establishing that he had provisions. I pointed down the mountain, the general direction of town. He shook his head. Interesting. I sat on the rock where he'd been sitting and thought about that. He was near 10 years old, deaf, had been up here alone for 3 days in cold weather, had some food, had found water, and when I offered him the way out he said no. Either he was afraid of what he'd come from or afraid of what was waiting in town. I had no way to ask and no way to understand the answer if he gave one. So I did what you do when you don't have the words. I stayed put and waited and watched. He studied me back. Kids do that. They run a calculation on you that they can't articulate, but that is rarely wrong. After a while he sat down again on the plank, closer to me than he'd been. That was enough for now. I'd brought food in my saddlebag, nothing fancy, some cornbread and a strip of jerked beef, and an apple that had gone a little soft. I took it out and divided it on the flat rock between us, more on his side than mine, and ate my piece and didn't look at him doing it. By the time I'd finished my cornbread, his side was gone. I stood up and brushed off my knees and pointed down the mountain again. He shook his head again, more firmly. I pointed at him, then at myself again. Meaning, you come with me, I'll be with you. He thought about that longer than before. Then he stood up and came. It's a particular thing, riding double with a child who doesn't speak and can't hear and doesn't know you. He sat in front of me with his back against my chest, and I kept one arm around him, loose, and the bay picked down the slope, careful as always. After a while I felt him stop holding himself quite so rigid. He didn't lean on me. He just stopped bracing against me. That was how he said thank you, I think. We got to town by mid-morning, and I hadn't decided yet what I was going to do with him. The obvious answer was me Heller, who ran what passed for an orphan's home 2 streets off the main road, but I didn't like the obvious answer. Something about the way the boy had looked at me on that mountain, the calculation he'd run, the decision he'd made to trust me rather than go down alone. I wasn't going to hand that to me Heller and her $3 a week county stipend. I tied the bay to the rail in front of Gruber's dry goods and lifted the boy down. He stood by the horse's shoulder looking at the street, and I could tell by the way he held himself that he was somewhere he'd been before and that he didn't much want to be here. Whoever had last seen this boy, they were in this town. I hunkered down beside him, pointed at him, spread my hands. Who do you belong to? He looked at me for a long time. Then he pointed down the street, east, toward the wagon yard. The wagon yard was where immigrants stopped on their way through, or where people who had nowhere else to go ended up sleeping. I'd spent a couple of nights there myself, years back, before I'd got the cabin and the few acres I run now. She was at the far end, near the water trough, sitting on the tongue of a wagon with her hands in her lap and her back straight, just sitting. She'd been there long enough that the sitting had become a kind of work, staying upright, staying still, waiting the way you wait when the alternative is falling apart. Her name, I learned later, was Clara Marsh, widow of Thomas Marsh, who died of a lung complaint in Kansas the previous fall. She'd come west on a delayed instinct, the way widows sometimes do, not because she had a plan, but because staying in the place where someone died is its own slow drowning. She'd had $50 when she left, spent most of it on the fare and provisions, arrived in Garnet 3 weeks ago with the boy and a trunk and no clear idea of what she'd do next. She'd taken in washing for the hotel. She'd been asking about domestic work. She'd been sleeping in the wagon. And 4 days ago the boy had gone up the ridge to look for the old mine he'd heard men talking about in the wagon yard. Because a deaf child does not have the easy social life other children have, so he looks for things instead. Holes in the ground, funny-shaped rocks, places where the world does something interesting. He'd gone up there, and the passage he'd squeezed through to look at the flooded shaft had shifted in the night, and he'd been stuck on the collar side, unable to get back. She hadn't slept. I don't know exactly how to say what she looked like when she saw him come around the end of that wagon, except that it was the kind of moment you do not witness very often and that stays with you. She didn't make a sound. She came off that wagon tongue like a cat, very fast and very quiet, and she had him in both arms and her face was in his hair, and she was still making no sound, which was how I understood she'd learned to cry without crying, because the boy can't hear you anyway and you don't want to scare him. I stood back and gave her room. After a while she straightened and held him at arm's length and looked him over, the professional once-over of a mother who needs to know if anything is broken. He signed something to her. I didn't know then that he'd been signing since he was 4, that she'd learned with him, that they had their own language worked out together. She signed back. He pointed at me. She looked at me then for the first time. It was a look that took a while and that didn't drop anything or pretend to. He was up on the Delacroix claim, I said. South slope of the ridge. 3 days near as I can tell, he's all right. She said, I know the claim, I didn't know he'd found his way up there. A pause, he likes mines. I could tell. She reached into her coat pocket and brought out a fold of bills. How much? Nothing, I said. She looked at me, Mr. Alcott, James Alcott. I put my hat back on. He's fine, that's enough. She held my eyes for another moment, then she put the money back. I should have left it there, ridden home, put the horse up, gone back to my life. My life at that point was about as follows. The cabin, 60 acres of marginal grass, a small cattle operation that ran about 40 head when things were going right and less when they weren't, a root cellar, a garden in summer, church at Christmas if the weather allowed it, and the general company of no one in particular. My wife Ellen had been gone 8 years. We'd had no children. I'd learned to make cornbread that wasn't insulting and to sleep through the quiet, and to want things on a modest enough scale that disappointment didn't get much purchase. I hadn't planned to change any of that. But I went back to the wagon yard 3 days later on the pretext of checking on the boy, which was not entirely a pretext. I did want to see he was all right, but also. She was washing something in a bucket when I came around the corner of the wagon. She looked up and said my name, Alcott, not Mr. Alcott, just the name, which surprised me. The boy was nearby with a rock collection he was arranging by some system of his own. You didn't have to come, she said. I know. She wrung out whatever she was washing and hung it on the wagon side. The boy had noticed me and gave me a small nod, the nod of one person who has shared something to another person who shared it too. I asked her if she'd found work. She said she was managing. I asked if she had a place to stay through winter. She said the wagon was acceptable for now. It was April, cold still, and the wagon was not acceptable. We both knew that. I said I've got a claim up on the ridge, flooded and useless but the cabin sound. She looked at me. It's got a stove, I said. The pipe needs putting back in, but that's an hour's work. The floor's dirt, but it's dry. 2 rooms, I thought it was 1, but there's a back section behind a partition I missed. That last part was true. I'd ridden back up there the day before on what I also told myself was a pretext and found the partition. You'd be alone up there, a mile from town. I'm not proposing anything except a place out of the weather. A long quiet. She had a way of looking at you while she thought that most people would call unsettling. I didn't find it unsettling. I found it honest. "The boy likes the mine," she said finally. "The shaft collar's fenced off." She almost smiled. "He'll find another way." "Probably," I said. She took the cabin. I put the stovepipe in that afternoon, and she was there watching me do it, not with the particular expression some women have when they're watching a man do a thing they could do themselves if they had to, that patient, tolerating expression, but watching the way you watch something that interests you. She handed me things when I needed them without being asked, because she'd already figured out the sequence. The boy went straight to the shaft collar to look at my fence. It was adequate. He found a gap in it within 10 minutes. I watched him find it, and then I watched him look back at me with an expression that communicated clearly. "I have noted your fence, and here is what I think of it." I went over and fixed the gap, and he watched me fix it with the same interested look he'd had looking at the water down in the shaft. Fixing things while someone watches doesn't embarrass me the way it does some men. My father was the same. You're not performing competence, you're just doing the work, and if someone is standing there, that's their business. The boy seemed to understand that. He stood close enough to see exactly what I was doing with the wire, and when I handed him the end to hold, he held it. Clara called us both for the meal she'd made from what she had, which wasn't much. Salt pork and some dried beans she'd stretched with water, and a scrap of something I couldn't identify, but that tasted fine. We sat at the one table in the two-room cabin, me, her, and the boy, and ate in something that was not yet comfortable but was not uncomfortable either. The boy used his hands to talk to her when he wanted something, and she used her hands back, and occasionally she'd tell me what he'd said, not in a labored way, just the way you'd relay anything. He'd asked if I owned the mine. I said I did, more or less, $3. He signed something. She translated without looking up from her bowl. "He wants to know why you bought it." I thought about that. "Felt like the right thing to do," I said. She looked up at that. The boy was watching my face. I said it again, facing him, and made the shape of the words clearly enough that he caught most of it. He nodded like that was a satisfying answer. There were two men who came to dispute the claim. I want to be clear about this. It wasn't some sudden dramatic thing where I rode in at the last moment. It was a disagreement that built over about 3 weeks, which is how most real trouble builds, slow and deliberate and full of legality being used as a weapon. Their names were Corbin and Aldous Reese, brothers, who ran a placer operation on the north slope of the ridge. They'd had an arrangement with old Delacroix, the details of which I never fully understood, involving water rights from a spring on the Delacroix parcel that fed down into their operation. Delacroix's flooded shaft had, by some underground logic I needed a surveyor to explain to me, altered the water table in a way that meant the spring was bigger now than it used to be, and the Reese brothers wanted access to it. Which was fine. I was willing to talk about access. What I was not willing to do was sell them the parcel, which is what they actually wanted, and what they moved toward wanting in the way of men who are used to wanting being the same as getting. Corbin Reese came to my cabin first, alone, pleasant enough, with an offer that was about twice what I'd paid, but about a quarter what the water rights were probably worth if you did the math. I said I'd think about it. He came back a week later with his brother, and the offer was the same, but the visit was longer, and included a number of observations about how a man of my age, alone, on a modest operation, without. And this is where he looked off toward the ridge in a way that was meant to seem casual, without many people around him, might find himself in a difficult position if the county assessor were to take an interest in some irregularities in his grazing lease. There were no irregularities in my grazing lease. I said, "Come back when you've got something worth saying." Aldous Reese, who was the younger brother and the dumber one, said something then about the widow up on the ridge, something about how it must be nice for me, and how if I got tired of the arrangement there were men in town who'd be happy to. I stood up. I'm 61 years old. I was a bigger man 20 years ago, but I did not get smaller in a way that matters. Aldous Reese stopped talking. You finish that sentence, I said, and the only question is where I break it. He didn't finish it. They left, but that kind of men don't leave for good. I rode up to the cabin that evening and told Clara. Not everything, not the crack Aldous had made, but the shape of the problem. She listened the way she listened to everything, all the way through, and then she said, "Will they come back?" "Yes." "Do you want me to move?" It wasn't a question about what she should do. It was a question about what I wanted. I understood that, and it mattered that she'd asked it that way. "No," I said. She looked at the stove she'd been tending. The boy was asleep in the back room. Outside the window the ridge was dark against a sky still holding the last of the light. "I'm not afraid of them," she said. "I know you're not. I don't want you to have trouble on my account." I put my hat on the peg by the door, which I'd started doing without thinking about it around the second week. "The trouble's on their account," I said, "not yours." She was quiet for a moment. "Then thank you, James." She used my first name. I don't know if she'd planned to or if it just came out. It sat in the air between us, plain, not loaded with anything except what it was. I said goodnight and went home. The third visit from the Reese brothers was in May, when the county assessor they'd apparently been talking to showed up with a surveyor and a document suggesting that my deed from the tax auction had a technical defect involving the filing date. This was, as far as I could tell, manufactured from nothing, but it had enough official paper around it to slow things down and cost me legal fees I did not have. I went to see a lawyer in Montrose, which was a day's ride each way, and came back with information that was encouraging in the long run and expensive in the short run. Rode home in the dark, tired, tied the horse and went inside and sat down, and that's when I understood for the first time in about 8 years what it felt like to not want to be alone with the problem. I sat there in the cabin. The lamp was low. Outside the wind was doing what the wind does in Colorado in May, which is anything it wants. I thought about Ellen, the way she'd sit across from me when something was wrong, not saying much, but present. Fully present in a way that made the problem smaller, not because she'd fixed it, but because two people carrying a weight is a different thing than one. I went to bed. In the morning I rode up to the claim. I told myself I was going to check the fence the boy had found the gap in. Clara was splitting wood when I got there. She saw my face before I said anything. She put down the maul and wiped her hands and said, "Tell me." So I told her, all of it. The surveyor, the document, the lawyer, the money, and what I thought the Reese brothers were likely to do next. She listened. The boy came out at some point and sat on the step and watched us. When I was done, Clara was quiet for a minute, thinking. "I have money," she said. "Clara." $40. I've been putting away from the washing. She said it without drama, not an offer, just a fact being laid on the table. "It's yours if you need it for the lawyer." "I'm not taking your money." "You found my son," she said. "That's not." "James," she said it the way she said everything, straight on, nothing extra around it. "You found my son. You fixed the stovepipe and you fenced the shaft and you stood up to those men. You bought a piece of ground that nobody wanted because it felt like the right thing to do." She looked at me. "I see what you are. I've seen it since the first morning." I didn't answer. There wasn't an answer for that, not when you put in words. The boy on the step was watching both of us. He'd been lip-reading what he could and watching what he couldn't, and I suspect he understood most of it. He looked at me with that same direct calculation he'd had when I first found him, and then he nodded, like he was confirming something. "We didn't take Clara's $40. We didn't need to in the end," the Reese brothers. faced with an attorney's letter and the attention of a county judge who did not like sloppy paperwork and liked manufactured paperwork even less, stepped back from the filing date argument and tried one more angle, which also didn't hold, and eventually gave up. Men like that usually do when the cost-benefit tips against them. They weren't crusaders. They were opportunists. The water rights I sold them a fair access arrangement for, at a price that covered my legal fees and put a little left over. That was in July. By then Clara and the boy had been on the Delacroix claim for almost 4 months. I'd been going up there regularly. I told myself it was to manage the property. The boy and I had worked out a communication between us, part signs, part writing on flat rocks with chalky stone, part the particular nonverbal language you develop with someone you spend time around. He showed me things. He had a rock collection that was better organized than it looked, with a genuine sorting logic that I didn't fully understand but that he explained to me patiently, with rocks held up and tapped and set side by side. He'd found a second seep up the ridge, cleaner water than the first. He showed me the spot where the fault line had slipped, where you could see the layers of rock pushed past each other. He liked to know how things worked and how they'd gotten the way they were. I'd been a man on my own for a long time, and what I'd noticed about being on your own is that it doesn't bother you until it does, and then it bothers you all at once. I didn't push anything with Clara. She was a practical woman with a hard year behind her and her own sense of what she needed and what she didn't, and she wasn't the kind of person you pushed. What we had was a working relationship that was also a friendship, which is not a common thing, and which I didn't want to disturb by making it into something it hadn't decided to be yet. But it was deciding. I knew it the way you know things that you don't say out loud yet, because saying them out loud is a one-way gate. I was past the age where I had much patience for dancing around what was real, but I was also past the age where I needed to rush it. It was real. That was enough for now. The evening in late September that I remember most clearly, we were sitting on the bench outside the cabin. The boy had gone inside. He had a lantern and was drawing something, a diagram of the mine shaft as near as I could tell from the glimpse I'd got. The sun was behind the ridge, and the sky was the particular color it gets in Colorado at that hour, a greenish pale blue, and the air had just enough cold in it to make sitting in the last warmth feel like something you wanted to hold onto. Clara said, "I've been thinking about staying." I looked at her. "Through winter," she said. And after, she was looking at the ridge, not at me. "The boy's settled. He's learning the ground up here. She paused. "He's happy." "He is," I said. She turned and looked at me then, fully the way she did. "You've been good to him. You've been good to both of us." "It wasn't. I didn't do it to be good." "I know," she said. "That's why it means something." We sat with that for a while. The light was going, the sky deepening. "I want to be straight with you," she said, "because I think that's how you'd want it." "Yes. I'm not carrying Thomas anymore in a way that blocks things. I did for a while. It's been a year and a half." A pause. "I don't know what you feel or what you want. I'm not saying that I know. I'm saying what I feel and what I want, which is to be here and near you. If there's something in that for you." I looked at her. The back of my throat did something. It had been 8 years since a woman had said anything like that to me, or since I'd felt the specific gravity of a moment like this one, the held weight of it, the willingness in it. "Clara," I said, "you don't have to." "Clara," I waited until she was looking at me. "Yes," I said. It wasn't a complicated word. It was the only one I had. She put her hand on my arm just above the wrist. Not a gripping hold, she laid it there, light and certain, the way you set something down in a place you've decided it belongs. Her hand was wercruffened, the knuckles a little red still from the cold, and it was the most substantial thing I'd felt in 8 years. I turned my hand over and covered hers. We sat there while the sky finished going dark, and the first stars showed over the ridge. The lantern light moved in the window behind us. The boy, drawing his diagrams. The mine he'd found his way into, mapped out on paper now, every tunnel accounted for. There's a thing that happens when you've been without something for a long time. The way that when you finally set down a weight you've been carrying so long you stopped knowing it was heavy, you don't feel lighter right away. You feel it as an absence first. And then, after a while, you feel it as a new kind of possibility. Like you've got your hands free again, and can't quite remember what you used to do with them, but you're about to find out. That winter was hard, they all are up on the ridge, but it was the kind of hard that has warmth in the middle of it. We were not lonely. The boy turned 11 in December, and I gave him a good compass, and he walked around for 3 days pointing it at things, and comparing the readings to his diagrams of the mine. Clara made something for the occasion from dried apples and the last of the honey, and it tasted like nothing in particular, and exactly like what it was. She had a laugh I hadn't heard until December. Not often, she wasn't a woman who laughed easily, but when something got to her, it got to her all the way. The boy would see her laughing, and his whole face would change. I thought about my father, who had been a hard man and fair, and who'd once told me that the best thing a man could do was be worth a damn to the people who depended on him. He hadn't said it as wisdom. He'd said it describing a neighbor he respected. But it had stayed with me, the shape of it, as a measure of something. I don't know if I was worth a damn to anyone, most of my life. I kept to myself and minded my own and did my work and got through the winters. Ellen would have said differently, but Ellen was gone. But that winter, on that ridge, with a deaf boy who sorted rocks by a logic I was still learning, and a woman who put her hand on my arm like she meant to leave it there, that winter I was worth something. I could feel it. It wasn't a thing I needed anyone to tell me out loud. Though she did, once. In February, after a bad 2 days of storm, when the temperature dropped past anything sensible, and we lost a section of the stovepipe again, and I fixed it in the dark and the cold and came back inside half frozen, and she handed me coffee and said, "I don't know what we'd do without you." Just like that, plain and real, and looking at me like she meant it down to the floor. "You'd manage," I said. "Maybe," she said, "but I don't want to." The lamp on the table threw a circle of yellow light across her face. The storm was still going outside, the kind that makes the whole world feel very small and the inside of a warm room feel like everything. The boy was asleep in the back. I sat down across from her and wrapped both hands around the coffee and felt the warmth come back into my fingers, slow and painful and then fine. We were quiet together. After a while she got up to bank the stove. I watched her do it, the familiar competence of her movements, the way she knew where everything was without having to look, and I thought, this is what it is, this particular thing. The cabin on a ridge in February, the storm outside, the boy asleep, the woman you didn't plan for moving around the room like she belongs there, like you belong there. Which is the thing, really? After 8 years of going through the world like you've got somewhere to be, but no particular reason to get there. After all that, to have a place. A specific place, on a specific ridge, with specific people who know your name and count on your being there. I sat there with the coffee, and I didn't say any of it, because you don't have to say the things that are already true. Outside, the storm went on a while longer, and then it didn't. In the morning the ridge was white and clean, and the sun came up cold and exact over the east slope and hit the snowfield outside the window and made it bright as anything. Clara poured coffee, and the boy came in from the back room with his compass already in his hand, ready for another day of figuring out where he was. I pulled on my coat and my hat and went out to check the fence. The gap was still closed.